morning, Gloucester. We're here today with Sean Hurley in his printmaking studio at Beacon Marine Basin on East Main Street in East Gloucester. And today, Sean's going to take the time to show us how he turns a copper plate into the kind of print you see on his walls in his studio. Sean was featured on Good Morning Gloucester a couple of months ago, where he showed us how he etched this copper plate. And today he's going to show us how that copper plate yields a beautiful 11 by 17 or so size print. So Sean, take it away and tell us what we're going to be doing today.
Today we're going to be inking a new copper plate that I've just finished after several months of work. Last year you saw me actually etching a plate and how that's done. Today we're going to see the other half of the printmaking process, perhaps the most important part, and that's the actual printing.
There you have it, ladies and gents. Sean's going to take a half an hour to 40-minute process, and we're going to try to compress it down into a 3-minute Good Morning Gloucester segment. So Sean, let's get this done.
Let's print.
So Sean, what are you up to right now?
Right now I've just removed some of the ink from the can, and I'm just sort of working it up and warming it on the plate, making sure it's mixed up well, loosening it up a little bit. Usually when people hear ink, they think of what comes out of a pen. This is certainly a little more like oil paint.
And it looks like you're just using a spatula, or I mean
just a regular
putty
palette
knife.
knife.
Yeah, palette knife. And it looks like you have a business card in your hand. What's that?
This is basically just a small piece of mat board, and it ends up being just a cheap, disposable way to ink the plate. You want something that'll effectively spread the ink, but something that's kind of soft and pliable enough that it won't scrape the plate in the process. So some people use like little rubber squeegees. In the Renaissance, they would have used like some sort of a leather dabber or something, but most artists probably have scraps of mat board laying around, so this is just an easy and economical thing to use.
And this is a copper plate that you etched this winter, or when did you etch this?
I've been working on this plate over the course of the last few months, generally from start to finish. They take me anywhere from 1 to 3 months. This probably took about 2.5 months, and this is the biggest etching that I've ever executed.
And I'm curious as to why it takes so long to get a plate etched.
The etching is not all done in one stage, so there isn't I'm not just doing the drawing on the plate from start to finish, etching it, and then having it finished. I'm doing one round of drawing, etching it into the plate for a given period of time, doing another round of drawing on top of that, etching that in, so on and so forth. So this plate actually took, I think, 16 states to reach its finished product. So each of those states can take, up to a week or two sometimes for me to draw and etch.
Tell us a little bit about your background and training. I guess you went to UNH. Were you a fine arts major there?
I went to UNH where I got my BFA in printmaking. While I was at UNH, I started working as an intern with Don Gorvet, who was a local printmaker of definitely of some renown, I think in New Hampshire and New England.
And Don had that studio on Main Street in the West End for a while, didn't he?
Right. Don had a shop. Initially, when I was in school, he had a shop up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and that's where I started working with him as an intern. And then he opened a shop down here in Gloucester. He had a long history in Gloucester. He'd spent a lot of time here when he was younger and loved Gloucester. So he opened the shop here and eventually closed the shop up in Portsmouth. And I decided to come down here and work full-time at his shop. So that's how I ended up in Gloucester. And unfortunately, he ended up closing the Gloucester shop, but I decided to stay here.
And are you living in town now?
I do. I live here in Gloucester full time.
Yep. And how long have you been renting the studio space here at the Basin from Jackie Alexander?
Well, actually, this started when Don opened the shop. He didn't have the press in the actual gallery, so he started renting this space with his press. And when he shut down his shop, he wasn't sure what he was going to do with his press, so I kind of took over the space. I babysat his press, and I kept working out of here. And Don's recently opened a new shop up in Agunquit, Maine, so he moved his press up there, and I actually purchased a press of my own at that time. And I was back, I think, in April or May, so that I moved this press in here.
And like many artists and creative people and musicians, you also have a day job. I understand you work here in town?
I do. I cook full-time at Halibut Point.
Halibut Point over there on Main Street by Earl's Lock Shop, right?
Exactly.
Okay, what's going on now? I see you've picked this.
Smeared ink across the entire plate, and that's kind of an inexact process. It's just a mission to make sure that every square inch of that plate has been covered with ink. And now I'm just kind of cleaning up my workspace before I move on to the next step of the process, which is going to be a little more exacting. And that's going to be making sure that the plate is actually inked the way I want it to be. So right now there's just a coating of ink everywhere, smeared across the whole surface, down in every line. And if I was to print this right now, it would just be a giant black square.
So I see you picked up a bunch of is that cheesecloth?
This is called tarlatan, and what it is, it's a starch cheesecloth. So the idea with this is that it's absorbent enough to remove ink from the surface of the plate, but due to the starching, it's stiff enough that when you're wiping the plate down, it's not going to reach down into the lines and pull the ink out. The ink will stay where you want it to stay, but leave where you want it to leave. And it's not an automatic thing. There's as much artistry and craftsmanship in the inking and wiping of the plate as there is in the actual drawing of the etching, I think.
So as you go from this black mess of goo here, what are we going to end up seeing when you're all done wiping?
What we're going to end up seeing is that the image that we're going to print is going to emerge on the plate kind of from this black mass. So what I'm doing here, in an etching, it's the lines etched into the plate that hold the ink in print. So right now, by rubbing it with the cloth, I'm removing the ink from the smooth raised surfaces of the plate, but allowing it to stay on the plate down in those etched lines. So little by little, I'm going to wipe the surface of the plate clean until the ink only remains where I want it to remain, in those etched lines and in very small amounts elsewhere. So a lot of people assume that in etching, once you make the plate, it's just a repetitive print one, print another, they're all exactly the same. But really every etching is a handmade original because the wiping is such a touchy process and the printing is all done by hand. Everyone's going to come out a little bit different.
So this is more the craft of the art than the art of the art.
I'd say there's as much of an art to this, in a way, as there is in the drawing and creation of the plate. And in a way, you could actually say drawing is kind of an intuitive thing, but this is definitely something that you need to learn. And it's the hardest part of the process to teach, without a doubt.
And I see you've changed from a horizontal and vertical motion to a wiping, rubbing motion. What's going on here?
Right. I use the straight motion just to kind of even out the ink on the surface of the plate. And it's really this circular motion that does the job to wipe the plate down and remove the ink from the smooth areas, like I was saying before. So I'm constantly moving to a different part of the rag here. If I just kept using the same part over and over, rather than removing the ink, I would really just be smearing it around.
Would it be okay if you stopped for a second and held that vertically so we can see what's emerging here? And if you could tilt it at a few different angles to get the glare off. Yeah, a little more horizontal. Okay, thank you. So I'd interrupt you there.
Sorry. I said this would take 40 minutes. It'll probably take like 5.
Sean, can you tell us a little bit about the print you're working on?
Yeah, this is a new print called Maplewood, and it's based on a drawing which I have tacked up on the wall over there right now. A drawing that I did over behind Shaw's on Maplewood Ave, and it's looking down the tracks in the Rockport direction. And it had started, I was doing a painting from the same spot, but looking in the opposite direction. So I was looking down the tracks towards the Gloucester station. And I turned around at one point and saw this view, and was so excited by it that I knew I had to do it as well. I was working on an oil painting looking in the other direction, but this scene was way too complex. I didn't think I could accomplish it in oils, so decided to draw it and make an etching out of it. So I did a drawing on site, which took about 2 weeks of occasional work, and then developed the etching in the studio from the drawing. I never use any photographs in the making of my prints. They're always based on drawings that I do on site.
So to anyone who knows Gloucester, this is a very familiar scene. It's the railroad crossing right behind the downtown Shaw's Market, where Maplewood Avenue runs towards Poplar Street.
So part of what makes the wiping and inking of the plate so challenging is knowing when to stop. You can easily wipe a plate down until all the nuance is removed, and you could also easily leave way too much ink on the plate. And I think one of the most beautiful things in an etching is what's called plate tone, which is just the thin veil of ink that's left even over the blank surfaces of the plate. So the real challenge in inking the plate is wiping it down so that all the detail's there and you get a nice balance of dark and light, but still leaving kind of these thin ghostly grays in the right spots, which are really just ink sitting on top of the surface of the plate.
Well, that scene has really come out vividly off of that mass of inky goo or gooey ink. And when you've done your wipe, if you hold it up one more time, the way this thing has just become so vivid, that copper color and the dark jet black ink. So here's Sean Hurley with his inked copper etching that he's soon going to turn into a print.
Sean, can you tell us what indicates to you that you're now done?
Yeah, I'm just looking for the balance of lights and darks. So the areas that I want to be really white, I'm looking at to make sure that they're standing out as being really bright. And then there are certain areas, like up in the sky here and kind of in the distance in places, where I like this really smoky gray. So what I'm really trying to do is emphasize the areas that I want to be the brightest white. I made sure to wipe those down to a nice shine, but I'm trying to leave just some background ink in other places. And then the areas that I want to be really dark, I want to make sure that that ink is sitting really thick on the surface of the plate. If I was to come in and over wipe that area, what would print as a really rich black would just die down and end up printing as kind of this feeble gray. So in a way, this is the hardest part of the inking process, is when you start to think you might be done, but you're not entirely sure. There's always the temptation to just wipe that one spot a little more, or maybe put some ink back onto the plate in another spot.
Sean, I'm going to move over to your right here, where you've got a big, what looks like a photographer's bin, or I don't know what you would call this, filled with water with, oddly enough, a big piece of paper in it. What's this all about?
That is the sheet of etching paper that I'm going to be printing on. And an etching needs to be printed on a dampened sheet of paper. So depending on what kind of paper you're using, you can either soak it down in a tray like that.
Tray, that's the word I was looking for, thanks.
Or if you're using a really fine paper, you might just kind of mist the back of it with a spray bottle.
And this is just plain old ordinary tap water,
Plain old tap water.
nothing funny or fancy in here.
Right, but the etching is printed with an oil-based ink, and everyone knows that oil repels water. So if you printed on a sheet of paper that was just literally soaking wet, none of the ink would come off onto the paper. So I'm soaking the paper so that it'll be soft enough and supple enough that the press will be able to push it down into these lines, and it'll really be flexible enough to absorb what's on the plate. But I'm going to blot it almost until it's dry so that none of the residual moisture actually repels the ink that's on the plate. So again, you can over blot the paper and you can under blot the paper. So a lot of the process really, there's always a fine balance between too much and too little, both in the creation of the plate. You can over etch an area, you can under etch an area. In the inking of the plate, you can over wipe it, you can under wipe it. In the soaking of the paper, you can over soak it, you can under soak it. So part of what makes the craft of etching so challenging is knowing in each part of the process when you've gone far enough or when you haven't gone far enough.